parallel passage there in the book of Colossians, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 21. And you can again see the same thing here. And you who were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he is reconciled. So even here, Paul is telling these Gentiles, you at one time were alienated. You were a non-participant in these covenant promises that were made, that were given to Israel, right? Israel is the only nation that God has covenanted to fulfill various promises to. Look at Romans chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, and you'll see that there. The question is asked then in verse 4, who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises, of whom are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, the eternally blessed God forever. So there you see a passage that deals with the humanity and the divinity of Christ. So again, in these covenant promises, God has covenanted only with Israel to do certain things. Remember that as we read before in the psalmist, Psalm 147, let me read that for you, just to kind of remind you again, verses 19 and 20 of Psalm 147, we read this. He, that is God, declares his word to Jacob, his statutes and his judgments to Israel. He has not dealt thus with any nation. God has given his covenant word, his promises to the nation of Israel. Now there are various covenants that are made in the scriptures, and we'll look at those. There's the Abrahamic covenant, there's the land covenant, Davidic covenant, the new covenant. There are other covenants, the Mosaic covenant, and we'll get to those in just a minute, and I'll show you a nice diagram of those. If you go back to Genesis chapter 15, and of course in Genesis 12, God gives the promises to Abraham, how he's going to make his descendants a blessing to all nations. And in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18, this is where the covenant is given. And you see, yes, on that same day, verse 18, on that same day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Right? He's given them all of that land. That's the first covenant that he makes with them. Then if you go over to Deuteronomy, I just want to bring out a couple passages for you. And look at Deuteronomy chapter 29. Yeah, look at Deuteronomy chapter 29. I just want to point out a couple verses, and then we'll get into these a little bit later on. But this is just to sort of familiarize yourself with these covenant themes. In chapter 29 and verse 1, he says, these are the words of the covenant which Yahweh commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab. And notice the next word, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. This is a totally different covenant. Now, for many of you, you signed a statement after you went through the classes to become a member here, and you agreed or you sided with the perspective that you believe that one day we would have a literal messianic kingdom on earth. Now, I think this is kind of interesting. I don't really understand why people have a problem with the land covenant as it's spelled out here. I mean, if you have a king and you have a kingdom, you have to have a land to have the kingdom in, right? And so that's what we believe. We believe in a literal future land, and we'll see that as we go on through there. But notice verse 4 of that 29th chapter. Yet the Lord has not given you a heart to perceive and eyes to see, ears to hear, to this very day. In other words, you can't see. You don't understand the way that you should. Look at chapter 30, which is still part of this covenant. And notice verse 6 of what he says, and we'll get into this later on. But this is after they've been regathered, after they've been reinstituted, after they're one nation once again, and the Lord and Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart, the heart of your descendants, to love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. What covenant is that? It's the new covenant. God said, I'm going to give you a different covenant, not like the old covenant, but a new covenant. I'm going to give you a heart that you'll want to obey me. And then Psalm chapter 89, if you're not familiar with that, Psalm chapter 89, we looked at the Abrahamic covenant and the land covenant. Look at Psalm chapter 89 here. You can look at this in Samuel and Chronicles as well. But Psalm 89 verses, let me just read 1 through 4. I will sing of the mercies of Yahweh forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. For I said, mercy shall be built up forever. Your faithfulness you shall establish in the very heavens. I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to my servant David, your seed I will establish forever and build up your throne to all generations. Selah. And you see that whole 89th Psalm is that covenant promise to David, telling David, from your descendants, I'm going to make a kingdom. And then, of course, you have what we call the new covenant. And since we don't really go there, look at Hebrews chapter 8. Give you a couple different passages to think about here. Hebrews chapter 8. And we'll read verses 8 through 12. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 through 12. And I want you to notice something about this as well. Beginning in verse 8, because finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, when I will, this is future, I will make a new covenant, not with the church, but with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I discarded them, says Yahweh. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws in their mind, write them upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is future. It's not now. It's still yet future. Even in Romans 11, verse 27, the tense there is a futuristic tense. So here we have several unconditional, or what we call unilateral covenants. The Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. And I'll get to what those terms mean in just a minute. We also have what we call the conditional covenant. There's one covenant that is conditional, that is what we call bilateral. Not only does God do something, people have to do something in order for them to receive the benefits of that. Go back to Exodus, and again, I'm just sort of trying to whet your appetite here. We'll get into a deeper study of this in a moment. But notice in Exodus chapter 19, this is right before the giving of the law, Exodus chapter 19, and you're going to see how this plays into salvation as well. But Exodus chapter 19, and notice verse 8. Let me just read in verse 6. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all the words which Yahweh commanded them. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we what? Will do. You see that? We will do everything that you just told us to do. We'll love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We'll love our neighbor as ourselves. We'll keep these 10 commandments. We will do these things. Now, notice in chapter 24. Go over just several chapters. In chapter 24, notice just a couple verses there. Chapter 24, verses 3 and 7. So Moses came and told the people all the words that the Lord, that Yahweh, and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said, we will do. We will do. We will keep this covenant. We will bilaterally engage in this covenant with God. Verse 7. Then he took the book of the covenant. That is the book of the covenant. When you read the covenant, the ark of the covenant, they had the ark, and within that ark of the covenant, they had the covenant stipulations, or the law of Moses, within that ark of the covenant. He took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said, we will do and be obedient. So again, they're saying, we will do these things. You have the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 27 when they're re-giving the law. So what is a covenant? I mean, that's the question, and I don't know if this overhead's going to work. We'll see in just a minute here. All right. Now, I would just suggest to you that you could be open as much as you know about covenants and being familiar with them. These are just several of the covenants that are listed. I'll just run through them, and I'll give you what I think maybe is the same thing. They have the Edenic covenant of rule, where God creates man. Man is supposed to represent or rule God's creation for him and on his behalf. I think that Edenic covenant is the same as it's sometimes called the covenant of works. Okay? I think that's the same thing as the Mosaic covenant. You hear in Reformed circles people talk about the covenant of works and the Mosaic covenant. Did Jesus have to keep the covenant of works, or did he keep the covenant of the Mosaic covenant? Issues like that, and we'll get into that as we go. There's the Adamic covenant, or the covenant of redemption, in which there must be the death of Christ, the firstborn. I think that's the same thing as the eternal covenant or the new covenant in regeneration. So notice how I've linked the Adamic covenant or the covenant of works with the Mosaic covenant. They're both working. The covenant of redemption with the new covenant. And then you have the Noahic covenant of restraint, where God restrains from flooding the earth again and destroying it there. You have the Abrahamic covenant, which the promises are in chapter 12 of land, seed, and blessing. Then you have the Mosaic or the bilateral covenant, which you find in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, which they say we will do. Everything that God said we should do, we are in agreement that we'll do that. Then you have the land covenant given in Deuteronomy 29 and 30, again reiterating the land, the seed, the blessing. And then you have the Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel chapter 7, where David is promised the throne, the house, the kingdom forever. And then, of course, you have the new covenant, which is yet future for the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So those are just a sort of overview of the covenants. Any questions so far, or do you guys already know that? Yeah. We don't have a mic person, do we? Or do we? Nope. All right. Go ahead, real loud. We'll get to that. The first one where you can look at Hosea 6, 7, and 8, 1 for the covenant of works, and we'll get there. The other one, the covenant of redemption, would be sort of the covenant of grace. You might hear that term, the covenant of grace, which is the same thing as the new covenant. Okay? Right? Good question. Any other questions? Yeah, Dave? I think there are batteries in one of those, Luke. Go ahead, Dave, real loud. All right, go ahead and give that to him, Luke. That last part where he says, they will all know me, neither one of them will have to say. Remember now, in what we call the Messianic kingdom, there are unbelievers, right? There are people who die at the age of 100 will seem to have died prematurely, Isaiah 65 and verse 20. There will be people who will be punished in Zechariah 14 for not coming up and observing the Feast of the Tabernacles. So there will be unbelievers there. As a matter of fact, at the end of that Messianic kingdom in Revelation 20, we have a great multitude. The Bible says that we're numbered like the sands of the sea. They come up with Satan to go against the Messiah in his coming, right? So do I think that we're in the fullness of that time? No, I don't. Right? I think that's a future messianic time. Anybody else have a different opinion on that? You think we're in that time period right now? No? Go ahead over here. Hang on just a minute there. I do want to take my time here because I think once you understand this covenant structure and once you understand that the Abrahamic covenant is the foundation and it's unilateral, that new covenant also stems from that unconditional covenant, which means you don't do anything. God has sworn by his own name to accomplish those things, all right? So once we get going, I hope that it'll click in for you. Go ahead.
Is it fair to say that the church has been able to enjoy aspects of that new covenant? I'm thinking of the law being written on our hearts. So you're saying the final fulfillment of this will be found in the future. Is there a partial fulfillment through the church in the new covenant? Just because we hear that term so much, new covenant for the church.
Yeah, well, listen to Jesus during the Passover. Likewise, he also took the cup. This is Luke 22, verse 20. After supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." And so remember, Galatians chapter 3, verses 14 and 16. We get in on the promise of the new covenant. So there are aspects of that new covenant that we are receiving. That is the promise of the Holy Spirit. But what we're talking about is the fullness of that time is not yet here. Everybody understand that so far? You have any disagreements with that? That's fine. Just go ahead.
Can I give the mic away now?
Yes, you can. Anybody else? Yeah, Luke?
No, I'm just going to echo what you said. Basically, I think in 2 Corinthians 3:6, Paul speaks about how God has made them sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. And so we're definitely in it now, but it's that already not yet concept. It's already here, but there's some aspects of it that we're not going to enjoy until later on.
And those would be yet future for our Messianic kingdom. Now, here's where the difficulty comes. A lot of people today, I don't know if you're familiar with this, how many lectures you listen to, books you read, videos you watch. But there are many people who are today talking about the kingdom. The kingdom. We're in the kingdom. We're doing stuff for the kingdom. We're building the kingdom. What do you mean by the kingdom? Do you mean the Messianic kingdom? Or are you just talking about God's kingdom as far as people being in the kingdom? You know, unless you're born again, you can't be part of the kingdom in that aspect. And we'll get to that as well. There's kingdom language, and there's about 4 or 5 different uses of the word basileia, or kingdom, in the New Testament. All right? You understand that? Yeah? Some? All right. Hopefully you'll get there. Right? So in the Old Testament, in Hebrews 12:85, there's over 270 uses of the verse covenant. It simply means to cut. And that's what we read. If you go back to Genesis 15:18, and I just want to point some of these things out to you to try to get you familiar with some of these concepts, because if you don't know them and you don't understand them, it is somewhat difficult. But in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 8, Yeah, on the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. So he cuts a covenant with Abraham. Look at 1 Kings, or just mark this down. 1 Kings chapter 14. 1 Kings 14:10. Let me get there real quick. 1 Kings chapter 14. During the days of Jeroboam, you know, the kingdom was in the north, it was in the south. God talks about cutting a covenant, making a covenant with the people. And in 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 10, therefore, behold, I will bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam, and I will cut off, correct. There's the word that you will see over and over and over again in the Old Testament. I will cut off, he says, from Jeroboam every male in Israel, bond free, and I will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam as one takes away refuse until it is all gone. Psalm 101. We could just read that. Psalm chapter 101. And notice there, verse 8. Psalm 101, verse 8. Early I will destroy all the wicked of the land, that I might cut off, correct, all the evildoers from the city of Yahweh. He will cut off. He has made a covenant. You can see this language over and over and over and over again. God using that term in the Old Testament, I will cut off these people. I will correct them. I will cut them off, right? Look at Jeremiah 34, and this is probably a good verse to use. You can see it in several other places. I just wanted to go back to Genesis 15 to make sure I did not overlook anything. Okay. So in Jeremiah chapter 34, and I want you to notice verse 18. I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not performed the words of the covenant. Now, what covenant would they have to obey? The Mosaic covenant. That's the only one that's conditional. Right? Remember, it's not the Abrahamic covenant. It's not the land covenant. It's not the seed covenant. It's not the new covenant, which is still yet future. There's only one bilateral conditional covenant, and that's the Mosaic covenant. Okay, and that's going to point to Christ. But I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not performed the words of my covenant, which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between the parts of it. They cut the calf in two. The karat means a cutting or a compact. Now, we don't use these terms. We would use, a marriage vow. We would use some sort of language as far as working for an employee of that sort, but we don't use this type of language, the cutting of a covenant like they did back then. Now, in the New Testament, you have the word diatheke. It's 12, the Greek is 1242. It's used in 30 verses. It means a disposition or a contract, especially of a divisory will, that is a person who leaves property to someone in a will. This contract is only ratified by the death of the testator. It only comes into effect by the death of the testator. Now, let me give you a couple verses just to think about in terms of this. Exodus chapter 24. Going back to Exodus again, this is where that language is sort of spoken of. You have to understand somewhat of the Old Testament. But in Exodus chapter 24, beginning in verse 6, Moses took half the blood and put it in the basins, and half the blood he sprinkled it on the altar and the book of the covenant, and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. Right? Verse 8, and Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. The blood was shed when they made this covenant with him, as far back as the Mosaic covenant. Now you can go up even further back to the book of Hebrews, and let me show you several things there. Maybe some verses you're not familiar with. But the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, Hebrews chapter 9, and I'll give you just several verses to look at and to think about for time's sake. Hebrews chapter 9. And notice again there, beginning in verse, verse 15. For this reason, he is the mediator. This is speaking of Yeshua, speaking of Jesus. For this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where there is a diatheke, a testament, a covenant, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. So the testator has to die. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood, which we just read, Exodus 24. For when Moses had spoken every precept to the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Jesus is called the surety or the guarantor of this new covenant. Look at chapter 7 and verse 22. By so much more, Jesus or Yeshua has become the surety or the guarantor of a better covenant. He is the mediator. He is the guarantor. He is the covenant. I mean, if you go back to Isaiah, and you can see this again in Isaiah chapter, 42. Go back to Isaiah chapter 42. Yes, verse 6. I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness, will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from their prison, and all who sit in darkness from the prison house. I am Yahweh, that is my name. My glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. And so we see that the death of the testator is what is required for the application of this covenant. Now, all of these covenants have to do with Israel. Again, when you go to whether it's the Noahic covenant in chapters 6 through 9, where you go through the Abrahamic covenant in chapter 15, where you go through the land covenant in chapter 29 and 30 of Deuteronomy, to the Psalms for the Davidic covenant, to the priestly covenant in Numbers chapter 25, or to the new covenant, you'll see that these covenants were made with Israel alone, not with Gentiles. Remember, Gentiles were to be cut off. Gentiles were to be destroyed. They had no part. As we read in Ephesians and Colossians, they were alienated from that commonwealth of Israel. Listen to, just again, Amos chapter 3. That's a very familiar passage, and let me read that for you if I can find it rather quickly. Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos chapter 3, and notice again verse 2. You only, God speaking to Israel, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, because of this, I will punish you for your iniquities. God says, you only do I have this special relationship with, in which I've given my word to, in which I've given all these promises to where you'll bring the promised seed and all the other things that we had talked about before. So again, what is a covenant? A covenant is an agreement. It's an agreement between two parties, and it represents the relationships formed between God and man, or man, or nation and nation. You see that. Go back to Samuel. Go back to 1 Samuel. You'll recognize this story. 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses, the first several verses there in 1 Samuel chapter 5. 1 Samuel chapter 5. This is where they take the ark, right? It's where they take the ark. Now, if we're looking at this sheet up here again, this is the relationship between the covenants given by God, right? And so what you have there is you have the Abrahamic covenant, which is unilateral. It's unconditional. God said, I will cut this covenant. It's between me and I will fulfill the obligations of this covenant. Abraham goes to sleep, and we'll see that later on. The promise is given to Abraham and his descendants, to the nation. The promises to all the families of the earth. You see in Genesis 12, the promises are given, and then in 15, he ratifies it with the covenant. You see then the land, seed, and blessing promises that come with that. The land, the seed, the Davidic, and the bilateral, the Mosaic covenant that is given to Israel. Then later you see the new covenant promised in Jeremiah 31. It's ratified in the death of the testator, which Paul says not even a man-made covenant can be changed afterward. Now, there's a lot of different type of covenants that we make. I'm not sure how familiar you are with all of these covenants. Let me see if I can find my paper real quick. And here we go. This is what we call a threshold covenant. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with what the threshold is. The threshold is the bottom of your door. And when you go in through the door, we think in Western terms, 21st century Western terms. We're dealing with people from the East. They didn't think the way we think. They didn't do stuff the way we do stuff. So for them, the threshold was a time when you wanted to covenant with somebody, make an agreement with somebody. You would put that blood in that doorpost underneath there, and if somebody was going to make a covenant with you, they would step over that blood into your house, into your home, and to make that covenant with you. Zechariah talks about this, and I'll get back to 1 Samuel in a minute, but the Zechariah passage, let me just read to you several verses there, maybe just the first 3 verses or so in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 12, let me read the first 3 verses there. The burden of the word of Yahweh against Israel. Thus says Yahweh, who stretches out the heavens and lays the foundation of the earth and forms the spirit of man within him. Now watch the cut off and language and so forth. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all surrounding peoples. The cup or the bowl, the dish, the threshold, the saf is the Hebrew term there. I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And it'll happen in that day, I'll make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all people. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces. You see that? They'll be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. So a covenant is a covenant agreement. Now, when we go back to 1 Samuel, and we remember how that they take the ark and they take it back to where they are, notice you remember this story. Let me read it for you rather quickly. Beginning in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 5, the Philistines took the ark of God, brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. When the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early in the morning, there was Dagon fallen on his face to the earth before the ark of Yahweh. So they took Dagon and set it in its place again. When they rose early the next morning, there was Dagon fallen on its face to the ground before the ark of Yahweh. The head of Dagon and both his palms and his hands were broken off on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso was left of it. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor any who come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon and Ashdod to this day. So you see what happens here. They make this covenant. They put they have their house of their different gods. They put the ark in there, and the ark of God, who is put by Dagon, drops Dagon, cuts off his hands, cuts off his head, and so you can see that sort of picture all throughout the Old Testament. So let me give you just a couple more things, and then we'll try to get on from there. There are two types of different covenants. There's what we call the unilateral or the unconditional covenant. It's binding only upon the one who makes the agreement. That's the Abrahamic covenant, which consists of land, seed, and blessing. That's a promise that God has made that he will fulfill. It's not obligated by anyone. And remember, the new covenant is what you and I are part of. So if this new covenant is unconditional, then your salvation is unconditional. You understand that? So you have the unilateral or unconditional covenant, and you see that in Genesis 15. You see it again in Hebrews 6, verse 17 and 18. I don't know if I've read that one. Let me read that to you one more time just to sort of remind you of it. Thus, God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two impossible things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled to refuge to lay hold of the hope that is set before us. God has covenanted himself to fulfill the obligations of this covenant, right? God has obligated himself to fulfill this covenant. So then you have the Abrahamic covenant, you have the land covenant again, the seed, and the new covenant. And then we have what we call the bilateral covenant, or the unconditional covenant with a covenantal blessing. The Abrahamic covenant, we have land, seed, and blessing. You see that? And then that unconditional covenant with a conditional blessing of enjoying the land, which we have to have if we're going to have a future kingdom. We have to have a land, and so that's part of that. So we have that conditional or bilateral covenant which God makes with Moses, where he's binding on both parties to fulfill their obligations, right? And I think that Christ fulfills this. You can look at Matthew chapter 5. Give you just a few verses here. Matthew chapter 5, and I realize we're kind of going hurriedly through this, but I want to try to set some of this up for you. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. Do not think, Jesus says, that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill them. Jesus said, I've come to fulfill the promises. Romans chapter 10. Another very familiar verse, Romans chapter 10 and verse 4. Let me read that for you again. You can look at 1 Corinthians 15, how he is the second Adam. But Romans chapter 10 and verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So you have the Mosaic covenant, or what I consider the Adamic covenant, this covenant of works that we see God makes with the nation of Israel. Any sort of questions so far? Or do you guys got all of that? If you have all that, just tell me, shake your head, and I'll go on to something new. Right? Any questions so far? Because we're about out of time, and I realize I crammed a lot in there. But I want you to get familiar with these covenantal terms that you'll see all throughout the Old Testament. And there's a reason for those terms. Right? Anybody else? Now, next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how every time God gave them the bilateral covenant terms of the Mosaic covenant, they broke them every time. Remember, in the midst of him giving them to them, they're down there making an idol. They're breaking the covenant terms already, showing that this covenant needs something more or someone more than who they were.